Hello and welcome to today's CEDIL seminar. I can see the participant count is climbing, so I'll just ramble a little while it stabilizes and start out by apologizing that we're beginning a little bit late, and obviously we've got a lot of great content to get through, but I'm confident we'll still get it all in. We are getting there, I think, with participants. So let me start out with the least important detail, which is introducing myself. I'm Tom Wilkinson. I'm the head of data science for the international development part of the UK government's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And I also work for the Office for National Statistics Data Science Campus. In that capacity, I look after a team within the FCDO who make use of big data variously to support decision making across the SDG community. And then that includes things like satellite data and ship transponders, as well as admin data, and using a lot of sophisticated techniques to turn that into information that decision makers can use, including for understanding the impacts of aid policies and global events. And hopefully that's a segue into today's topic. Now, the reason I'm chairing today is because CEDIL is funded through UK aid money from the British people, directed by the FCDO. I should also mention that today's event is sponsored by 3IE, and they will be recording today's session to make available on their YouTube channel for general consumption. The chat is disabled, but there is a Q&A function, and there'll be an opportunity at the end to cover some questions for the excellent panelists we have today. There'll also be a survey at the end, and CEDIL would really welcome your feedback on how the session has gone and what you would value in the future. Without further ado, I'll introduce those panelists. We've got Douglas Glandon to start from 3IE, followed by Michael Bamberger, who is a senior research fellow for 3IE and an independent consultant, as well as Maria Ruth Jones from Dime Analytics, and finally Alessandra Garbero, who is a lead development economist and at IFAD. So without dwelling on it anymore, I'll hand over to Doug, and he can give you a deeper explanation of what we mean by big data and why it's so important for impact evaluation. Over to you, Doug.
Thank you very much, Tom. Yes, so my name is Doug Glandon. I'm a lead evaluation specialist with 3IE, International Initiative for Impact Evaluation. And this presentation will sort of briefly set the stage for the rest of the conversation. And it builds on some work that we did at 3IE to take stock of big data work and impact evaluations. So the context for this and sort of why we were interested in looking at this is relates to the rapidly growing volume, granularity, and availability of recorded data around the world. Also combined with the urgency of responding efficiently and effectively to mitigate and abate the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is a particularly opportune time to reflect on the use of big data in measuring development impact. As I mentioned, the presentation provides an overview of a recent stock-taking effort by 3IE to get a sense of the scope, scale, and applications of big data in measurement studies, impact evaluations, and systematic reviews. And what we're seeing right now is the collision of two fields of study. So data science, which has grown dramatically in recent years, and impact evaluation. And this is generating numerous opportunities for strengthening impact evaluation, but it's also creating new challenges to address. So before we really get started, what is big data? There's no consensus term, but there's some useful definitions we can look at here. One from UN Global Pulse is that big data is sort of an umbrella term referring to the large amounts of data, digital data, continually generated by the global population. Another term, another definition offered actually by Bamberger and York, another co-author, is that big data is generated very fast, is huge in volume, and is too large to be analyzed on a single computer. So therefore requires us to adjust and have new ways of processing the data, making sense of the data. People often also talk about these V's, 3 V's of big data: volume, high variety, high velocity, the speed at which the data are being produced. And then others have expanded on this to have 4 V's, adding another V for value, or 5 V's, or 7, or 10, or 42 V's. And so as people are grappling with the term big data, people are still offering their own take on what it actually means. But just to give some examples of what can fall under this umbrella, it could range from social media posts to records of phone calls made, to e-transactions online, to satellite data, and more. Okay, so one natural question is, what's going on right now? How are people using big data for measuring and evaluating development outcomes? How does this vary by geography or outcome? What are the main technical, methodological, and ethical issues emerging? And more broadly, what lessons can be derived for impact evaluation going forward? So to answer these questions, we started by systematically searching the literature for measurement studies, impact evaluations, and systematic reviews that were looking at any kind of outcome within the Sustainable Development Goals framework. The search yielded over 17,000 records, which we then screened down to 437 studies, which became the foundation for our systematic map. The systematic map visually summarizes the evidence base, categorizing studies by the big data sources used, listed in the row headings on the left side of the map. Also by the development outcomes studied, shown in the column headings at the top of the map, and also by the study type, which we see in the legend at the bottom. And there's also a confidence rating for the systematic reviews based on a critical appraisal of those papers. So in each individual cell, you can see the size and the type of the evidence base linking a particular type of data source to a specific development outcome. If you access the map on the 3IE website, you can also hover over each of these bubbles to see the underlying studies and click on the links to access them.
Doug, excuse me to interrupt you. Are you meaning to share slides that you're speaking to? Because you haven't shared your screen, so we haven't seen any of those.
Oh, apologies. Thank you for noting that. I'll just show you what I was talking about and make up the time. Can you just confirm that you can see this?
We can, thanks.
Thank you. This is for those who want to review this afterwards. A few details on key terms of big data and the V's that characterize big data. A few key questions that were guiding our systematic mapping exercise, our search process, and a view of the systematic map and what this looks like on the 3IE website. We have data sources along the left side, outcomes along the columns at the top. And we have the types of studies along the bottom. Let's see if I can, this here. Okay. And if you click on any of the individual bubbles within the cells, you can see a list of all of the underlying studies that constitute that cell, whether that's impact evaluations or systematic reviews or measurement studies. So what did we find? We found that overall, there's a sizable and rapidly growing number of measurement studies using big data, which is shown in the middle row on the left, but a much smaller number of impact evaluations. And this gives us a sense that there's a lot of work being done to develop appropriate measures using big data, which could subsequently be used in impact evaluations. We also see that the bulk of the big data sources are machine generated, mostly satellites, and this is represented in the light blue, as compared to process mediated sources, which can include administrative data, call detail records, e-transactions, basically any events that happen as they are, or that are systematically logged as they happen, and human source data in the dark blue at the top. So this includes social media, crowdsourcing, citizen reporting. And the top categories of outcomes studied are environmental sustainability, economic development and livelihoods, urban development, and health and well-being. In terms of the geographic distribution, China, India, and the United States are the most studied countries. East Africa and Kenya specifically are the most studied within sub-Saharan Africa, while Brazil and Mexico are the most studied in Latin America. And most other studies had few or, most other countries, had few or no studies. So a couple of considerations to keep in mind. Though big data is often referred to in the media, blog posts, and discussions as if it's one coherent class of data, the V for variety that I mentioned earlier is actually quite important because the benefits and drawbacks can vary substantially depending on the type of big data. Just to give one example, satellite data can be particularly useful for impact evaluation because satellites are always on over geographic areas and over time, which makes it possible to estimate variables in the same way for an intervention group and a comparison group before, during, and after an intervention. In contrast, human source data can be substantially biased because the people generating the data may be different in important ways from those who are not. So for instance, if you were to crowdsource information from the public via mobile phone during a humanitarian crisis, that can unintentionally exclude those who may be most affected. Some challenges that we observed through the systematic mapping exercise related to data quality, transparency, and ethical issues, including consent, data privacy, data security, and unintended exclusion. And though these issues have been widely noted in the literature, they were discussed only minimally or not at all in many of these studies. There's also a general expectation that impact evaluations using big data will be less expensive than traditional data collection methods, but there's actually little reported information on this to do meaningful comparisons. So what does all this mean going forward? We expect to see an increased use of big data to measure and evaluate development outcomes. We can reasonably anticipate that clusters of measurement studies in a particular area will be followed by an uptick in impact evaluations as those measures are validated, as those particular data sources become more widely available, and as the methods for accessing and processing the data are more widely understood. It's already widely recognized that big data can create opportunities for faster, cheaper, and in some cases, more robust impact evaluations, and that it can help us investigate topics, locations, and situations that are otherwise more difficult to study, including fragile contexts, difficult to reach areas, humanitarian crises, and so forth. The findings of this work help add granularity and nuance to that understanding, but more work is needed, especially in unpacking the many ethical considerations in using big data to measure and evaluate development outcomes. It's also important to keep in mind that big data is a complement and not a replacement for traditional forms of data collection. There's still a critical role for locally gathered data to train machine learning algorithms, ground truthing to validate variables generated using big data, and mixed methods fieldwork to help tell the story of what's happening on the ground. And finally, I would just say the increasing ease of asking and answering questions about development impact from afar makes it important, more important than ever, to prioritize meaningful stakeholder engagement, including of policymakers, implementers, and clients or beneficiaries. And it also underscores the need to make sure advancing technologies of big data capture and processing don't disadvantage local researchers evaluating their own communities. So we encourage you to review the Big Data Systematic Map and accompanying report on the 3IE website. And I look forward to the rest of the panel discussion and the question and answer. Thank you very much.
Michael, would you like to go ahead? You're muted, sorry.
Is Tom going to introduce?
Sorry, Michael, I thought I had, but I was muted too. So in the interest of getting through our busy agenda, I think let's go straight into your talk.
Okay, well, thank you. And hello, everybody. I'm going to review again some of the points which Doug was discussing about some of the benefits and some of the blind spots with using big data. And this is based upon my experience over the last 5 years of reviewing a lot of big programs which try to integrate big data and evaluation for UN Global Pulse, for a number of other organizations. So I'm drawing upon that experience, but my background is basically as a program evaluator. So just thinking about some of the benefits of big data, the first one for anybody who has worked with conventional evaluations, that big data can just produce very, very much larger sample sizes. One of the major challenges for conventional evaluations is it's so expensive to collect data, you're always struggling to try to reduce your sample to the minimum possible to have a certain acceptable level of statistical significance. So with big data, you can often cover the whole population, or you can have very large samples, which means you can have much more disaggregated analysis. You can compare different groups rather than just getting aggregate data. You also just have a very wide variety of different kinds of data which you can use, which is a tremendous resource for people who've often before just maybe only be able to use perhaps one or two kinds of data. And you can also cover a much broader geographical area, which is really important when you're trying to understand complexity and understanding how a particular program interacts with many other social, economic, political, demographic factors which are changing. So these are very critical. And something which hasn't been exploited a great deal yet is the fact that you can now generate data over long periods of time. With satellite images, you may be able to generate data over a 20-year time period, which means that you can look at the time before the program began, and critically, you can look at what happens when a program has ended. So for the first time, you can begin to evaluate sustainability of programs. 3 years later, is the program still delivering water, educational services? Are the roads still functioning? So the long time period is something which is very critical as well. You can also reach inaccessible groups, vulnerable groups, refugee populations, people after disasters, which is very, again, very, very critical. And it now becomes possible to evaluate larger, complex programs. Every evaluation, the first paragraph says our program is very complex, and then you never hear any more about complexity, and you just go back to using a traditional pre-test, post-test comparison group design, for example, where you're just looking at the program and the narrow area around it. So now, for the first time, you can begin to look at complex programs, which is really critical if you're thinking about the SDGs, for example. You can also use much more sophisticated kinds of analysis with machine learning, AI, deep learning, which my colleagues will be talking about. So you can really begin to understand the dynamics of the processes of change in a way you couldn't before. One example of this, which is very exciting, is being able to generate natural experiments. When you have very large programs with covering a whole region or a whole country with many different kinds of interventions, you can now match groups using AI and machine learning to compare groups which have similar characteristics, but which have had different outcomes, and try and understand why that has happened. And so you can actually begin to do more rigorous kinds of analysis, which previously were extremely difficult. And finally, I'd just like to mention the predictive analytics and real-time data. Traditionally, one of the major criticisms of evaluation is it's mainly retrospective. It's doing a post-mortem on a program which has already ended and doesn't really make much contribution to ongoing programs. So now with predictive analytics and some of the other techniques, it's possible to actually analyze your data using natural experiments, identify some kinds of interventions which you think might improve the program, then actually test them in the field and getting continuous feedback to assess how effective they have been. So this completely transforms what evaluation is about, from something which is basically looking at accountability to tell the donors this program was great, but not doing this till the program has already ended, so your results can't really be used in a very dynamic way, to now being able to make this a very critical dynamic management tool. So these are just a few of the exciting benefits of big data. And on the other hand, a few of the blind spots, some of which Doug already mentioned. The first is bias. Most sources of big data only cover particular populations, people who have cell phones, who are using a particular app. So people often generalize to a broader population from a relatively small sample, which is an issue. Then often big data is claimed to be completely objective. In fact, it tends to have biases. Big data reflects whatever social and cultural biases there are in the countries or the cultures which you're working with. For example, many kinds of big data under assess impacts of programs on women or on minority groups. You can see this with all of the huge amounts of evaluation being done of the current pandemic. There's relatively little study has been done on the effects on vulnerable groups. So if you have biases in your culture, these tend to get reflected in the big data, including in how you design your analytical framework. This is not something magical, which is just comes completely from the computer. Humans are putting in analysis with the kinds of biases which they might have. Then AI is a tremendously powerful and exciting tool, but it can't do everything. And quite a lot of people have an almost magical faith. You hear this mantra, AI can solve any question. And so a lot of people uncritically accept the analysis without having significant human intervention. You claim AI is really great because you can save time, the machine will make the decisions for you. This doesn't always happen, but you can see this in quite a lot of cases. And automated algorithms where the AI is making decisions for you on who to screen for college applications, where the police should be focusing on high crime areas. A lot of these are based upon algorithms which the users don't necessarily understand because they're proprietary. You don't know what indicators went into the algorithm. So AI is tremendously powerful, but it's not magical. Then one of the big continuing battles between evaluators and data scientists is that big data tends not to look at causality. It tends to look at correlations. And if you're not careful, it jumps from saying if you've got a very high correlation, this means that there's a causal relationship, which is not the case. So this is one of the areas of weakness. You really need to focus more on understanding causality. One of the reasons for this is that a lot of the these techniques were developed for market research, where if you're developing advertisements, you don't really care why it was that the advertisement had an impact, but you're just interested if you change the font size, you get more clicks or more people purchase your product. But for development, you really need to understand the causality. So this is one of the critical areas that need to focus on more, I think. And then that's related to a lack of a theoretical framework to explain why things happened. If a program was successful in one area, you need to know, would this work in the same way in other areas? What are the factors which contributed to success? What were the factors which limited success? So we really need to have more of a theoretical framework. And then finally, there's the danger of top-down decision-making. Big data is often sold by saying, isn't it great? We don't have to waste time now going out to the field talking to people. We can sit in our office and our magical algorithms will tell us what people think. This doesn't always happen, but you can often see this is one of the arguments for big data. It's so much cheaper, it's so much quicker. You actually hear this phrase, you don't have to waste time going out to the field to talking to people. So anyone who has a background in evaluation can appreciate the issues involved there. So those are a few of the benefits and some of the blind spots. Later in the discussion, if we have time, I'd be happy to give a few recommendations on where we might go next in strengthening the use of big data. So thank you.
Thank you, Mike, for that probing examination of how big data can add value and can be problematic specifically for evaluation. We'll go over now to Maria, who will get into more depth about some of the practical considerations in using big data, both in terms of its quality and the reproducibility analysis that makes use of it. Over to you, Maria.
Great, thanks, Tom. Thanks to 3IE and CEDIL for organizing. It's a really interesting panel to participate on. As mentioned in the introductions, I work at Development Impact Evaluation, which is a department in the World Bank focused on impact evaluation, and we do a lot of work with both primary data and big data. What I want to focus on in the few minutes that I have today in this panel are these issues around data quality and transparency and reproducibility that Doug touched on in his slides, and Michael as well, that really matter to how we think about this data being used and what impact it has on the quality of the analysis coming ahead. I think there's lots of potential for using big data, so I want to be clear about that, but I think we need to really approach it critically and perhaps more critically than has been done to this point. So I think first, to speak about data quality, I think my major point, right, is that don't assume that big and real-time data sets are necessarily high quality. I think that there is a little bit of magic thinking of this is a huge data, it must be kind of infallible. And it's really important to think critically about that. If we think back to the survey world, systematic data checks have become a well-established best practice there for establishing data quality. But it's something that isn't very commonly done in the context of big data. And I would like to argue that I think it's as important to do data quality checks for big data, if not more important, because in the case of big data, it's rarely purpose-built for research, rarely specifically designed to answer a particular question, rather taking advantage of a data source that's out there that can inform a question of interest. So I'm going to talk about a few specific principles for how we're thinking about data quality checks at DIME. But I'm also pointing you here to a blog that we published yesterday, actually, that goes into all of these in more details with some practical tips on how to implement and more specific examples. But basically, there's 4 principles that we think about with data quality checks. I'd like to quickly review each of those. So the first is completeness. And that is verifying that all of the expected data points actually appear in the data set. So it's approaching a question with a sampling frame in mind and understanding how the big data source lines up to your expected sample, whether there's duplicate observations, whether the data is complete across time, space, and units of observation. And where feasible, comparing this source of data to other sources about the relevant population to establish whether coverage is complete. So I have two example graphs here on the slide of these types of charts, which are just illustrating checks performed on high frequency data. The panel on the left graphs data received over time, while the panel on the right graphs it over space. And you can see in both of these cases, by simply visualizing the data as it's received, it's quite easy to see where there are gaps in coverage. And a point I'll keep returning to is that it's really important to do this in real time as you're receiving the data, so that you're establishing what issues there are in the data as they come in, and those can be resolved in real time as well. The second principle for data checks is consistency. So in this case, I mean checking that values align across variables within the data in ways that are both internally consistent and consistent with your expectations as a researcher familiar with the context and familiar with other relevant data sources. The figures here show two examples of consistency checks. The panel on the left is checking that the number of daily transactions, for example, things like calls or SMS, is consistent with the number of users in aggregated cell phone data. The points in purple are problematic entries, since every transaction must have at least one user who originates it. The panel on the right displays a check for pollution sensors, comparing the values obtained for the same area and time by two different types of sensors. Points in purple are problematic, as the expectation is that the sensors should generate similar measures. And you can see in this case, they're very different. So those are points we'd want to investigate further. The third principle is anomalous values. So in this case, it's checking that all of the data points within the big data source fall within an expected range. And of course, your expectations around that, again, being informed by the local context and other relevant data sources, and identifying any unusual or implausible values. Here again, I have two example figures of these types of checks where anomalies were detected. The panel on the left shows how cell phone tower outages in gray were identified in aggregated cell phone data. The usage of the tower that's down decreases drastically, which is the yellow line, and a neighboring tower, the purple line, picks up the traffic, leading to a spike in the number of transactions for that tower. The panel on the right shows the same kind of checks for a different data source, which is high frequency data on vehicle speeds. This is looking at a specific subset of 4 vehicles over time. And you can see that the gray area marks a cutoff of 2 standard deviations, and which is just a kind of rule of thumb for anomalous values, for outliers that we'd want to look into and might want to consider treating differently within the data set. And finally, this is less of a specific check and more of just a general principle is how we think about doing data checks, is that it's really important to look at data quality as soon as data is received, because the sooner issues are identified, the more likely they are to be fixed. And this is something that's true across all data sources, right? It's true for survey data. You and the enumerators are in the field, you're more likely to be able to resolve and identify and resolve issues that come up. It's the same with big data sources, and that's for different reasons. But for example, it may be the case that data is purged from the server that you're getting after a certain amount of time. It could be that the person who's doing the extraction from the company you're working with leaves the company, and other people are not familiar with how that extraction was performed. It may be that there's only a specific term in the data licensing agreement where queries and verifications are allowed. So for any number of reasons, it's important to do this as quickly as possible. And we'll just give one example here, which is we were working with some microsensors to collect air quality data and having data coming in on a high frequency basis. The team was checking the data every day. And one day, saw that no data was collected, and that turned out that after a power outage, the sensor did not properly reset and begin collecting data again as it was supposed to have. So we were able to, fix that and reset it. But if it hadn't been noted that same day, it could have been a week, a month, 2 months, who knows how long of data loss. So that's just a small example of why it's important to look in real time. So I realized that was quite fast and a lot of visualizations and a lot of different data sets that I just threw at you, but I'd really encourage you to take a look at the blog that I linked to on the first slide. I'm sure those will be shared after the presentation to dig into more details. And the last thing I wanted to touch on, because it's really linked to data quality, or at least to research quality, is thinking about reproducibility and transparency issues with big data. And again, this is something Doug mentioned at the end of his talk. This comes up for us I think there's a few different challenges I'd like to highlight. So I will say first that at DIME, the standard is that we do reproducibility verification for all papers before they are published. So that's just making sure that all of the data and code files and documentation is sufficient and reruns to exactly reproduce the outputs in the published paper. This is more challenging for big data sources than it is for more traditional data sources. And that's because the analysis is more resource intensive. It can take a long time to reproduce, which is, on the one hand seems sort of trivial, but it actually matters quite a lot. If the analysis takes 3 days, 10 days to running that 3 times to ensure your results are stable, all of a sudden it takes a month instead of a matter of a few hours. It can be resource intensive in terms of computational power as well, and having access to the correct adequate cloud compute resources can be a real constraint, especially to researchers in developing countries. That's something that I think is changing and opening up, but there's still a lot of room to go. And even for ourselves, who have a lot of, within the World Bank, we have a lot of access to good computational resources. These things are still really difficult to anticipate and budget and prepare for. So there's a lack of transparency and issues there that matter, even at this level. These data sets are also often proprietary. So again, unlike survey data that the researchers themselves might collect and own, often accessing big data requires data licensing agreements or data use agreements with the owners. And there may be some restrictions there that limit reuse or publication of the full data set. So we take a lot of care in establishing the terms of use for big data, but I think that's something where in general there needs to be better norms and clearer practices across the field. And finally, is privacy concerns. There's really no well-established norms for how to de-identify big data sources and how to do that safely and effectively. And it's always going to be a risk and benefit calculation as to the accuracy of the data that's released versus the privacy risks to an individual. And that calculation is one that's changing a lot over time as more data is released and more data sets can be mosaicked and integrated so that all of a sudden, even if you de-identify your data set, it may be possible to link it with something else and re-identify. So that's something where, again, I think there's more, there needs to be better norms and more discussion in the field about how to handle it. So I will leave it there, but happy to discuss any of these points more in the Q&A.
Thanks, Maria, and I look forward to that discussion. So having covered some of the epistemological issues with Michael and some of the practical issues with Maria, let's take the opportunity with Alessandra to go through some deeper real examples of how to deal with big data using machine learning. So Alessandra, over to you.
Thanks, everyone. Can you see my screen? I guess so. So I'm very happy to be here to be able to present this work that I've done at IFAD. And so these are findings from the Innovation Challenge project, which is called Athena, Leveraging Artificial Intelligence and Big Data for IFAD 2.0. This is a project that I led, and I'm lead economist in the Near East, North Africa, and Central Europe division. So without further ado, let me give you some example of how we can use artificial intelligence, machine learning, big data for development effectiveness for agencies that invest in projects, in development projects. So here, okay, we talked a lot here about machine learning, but actually, how can it be useful, right? First, you need to collect, of course, have sizable data within developing agencies, right? So here, as part of this project, we analyzed a large amount of structured and unstructured data, and was internal and external data. mostly because we wanted to really uncover patterns and trends through machine learning. And why this is useful, because ultimately we are interested in predicting performance and impact outcomes, meaning what we term the predictive analytics, in order to guide future investments. And here it means new designs of development projects. So in a nutshell, this project aimed at doing different things, right? The first was to have a deep look at a portfolio of investments and systematize it, meaning extract knowledge and themes and strategic themes. This is because we need to do this for knowledge management, right, within big organizations. And ultimately, because we want to do some predictive analytics, for instance, predict what are the features of successful projects, or even identifying key features of beneficiaries in predicting impact. So really ex-ante designs of new projects. So of course, you need to have sizable data. And so this project went through a huge effort of collecting data on all investments projects at IFAD. We collected data of about 900 projects, and this is both qualitative data, meaning reports, what we call project design reports, midterm reviews, project completion reports. These are reports that basically summarize the main steps in a life cycle of a project. So we collected more than 2,000 documents. We also collected quantitative data, meaning also evaluation data, data from impact assessment, financial data. And so far we had 19 projects with impact assessment, and we also brought in some external data. So in a nutshell, this project basically had a number of work streams that were brought in an integrated framework. This is the entire project summarized in one slide. So the main objective was really to use machine learning models for data-driven decision-making. And for two main objectives, the sub-objectives, let's say, one is to systematize the portfolio of investments, and the other one was to do predictive analytics, meaning to support basically the new project designs with evidence. So in terms of portfolio systematization, here you can see what we used, various techniques like text mining, NLP, natural language processing, topic modeling, to really detect either strategic topics within text, like for instance, even the prevalence of food systems, reporting of SDGs, what we call at IFAD mainstreaming themes, meaning to what extent we target women or gender issues, climate change, but also we use it also to detect interventions within text and lessons learned. As far as the predictive analytics is concerned, we use algorithms for two main purposes. The first is to really predict the probability of a positive impact of an IFAD project, and also identify the features of beneficiaries that can maximize the project impact using impact evaluation data. And also what we did, and you see it at the bottom, we use algorithms to actually correct the underreporting of COVID-19 using Google Trends and mobility data to basically correct the underreporting and be able to guide investments in IFAD's beneficiaries countries. So this is it's very useful for development agencies that need to tailor their investment to and target their needs. So let me now delve into the results, and I'll give you a few visuals here. This is, for instance, concerning an analysis of to what extent SDG goals, so Sustainable Development Goals, are represented within project documentation over the entire history of IFAD. Here we just present results on basically the goal 1, which is no poverty, and we can see an increase, of course, of reporting against this goal. We tried also to look at differences going from project design reports and completion reports in the extent of goal represented. We did the same thing with an analysis of food system types within IFAD projects. And basically here, what we tried and discover and uncover through machine learning was actually understanding the distribution of food system types, or archetypes as they are called in the literature, in project documentation over time. And here we can see some graphs that show basically the first one is the prevalence in the types of food systems as represented in the project documentation. And here we have rural and traditional, modernizing and formalizing, informal and expanding, industrialized and consolidated, and emerging and diversifying. But most interesting is to look at how this food system evolved within the story of a project, meaning from the design to the completion. And we can see that there is a tendency to move from rural and traditional to modernizing and formalizing, which reflect the theory change of IFAD projects that basically aim at improving development outcomes and towards modernizing food systems. We also used machine learning algorithms to detect interventions, meaning granular interventions within projects. We have broader project types, and here we leverage on an advanced machine learning model designed specifically for agriculture to basically understand what kind of intervention and outcomes were present in project documentation. We also applied the similar methodology to detect actually lessons learned within project reports. And here we, of course, it's always subject to a number of reports. Here we mostly focused on project completion reports, which is the last report at the end of a project cycle, to see the lessons learning. And of course, this is also a reflection of the number of reports by language. But here we did some kind of seed modeling to understand, for instance, the words around concepts such as performance, impact, and development, for instance. But let me move now to the predictive analytics, which is really a tool for better project design. So, and I'm going to give you a snapshot of the COVID-19 impact model here. So here, as I mentioned before, basically we use a random forest algorithms to correct the underreporting of COVID-19 in countries, IFAD beneficiaries countries, using Google Trends and mobility data and other structural factors. This is because it's essential for IFAD to target investments where it's most needed, right? So these algorithms actually have the potential to really complement, not be a substitute, and I want to stress this, to the official data, supporting and preventing from mistargeting, for instance. And now moving to the impact prediction, which of course, here we use impact evaluation data. So here we can use different estimators actually for ex-post predictions. Like in one example here, we use 17 impact assessments fielded during 2016, 2018 to go really beyond the average treatment effects and look at the full impact distribution and actually estimate the impact at the household level to finally understand what are the observable characteristics that can predict higher or lower impacts, as well as the extent of people benefiting. And here, this is like a picture of a project, and actually percentages of beneficiaries impacted, having a positive impact by project evaluated. So again, this is triangulate the traditional tools. And again, I'm in favor of integrating methodology, of course, knowing all the caveats of all the possible methodology and integrating methods and tools. Finally, and this is like I think the most important application of machine learning is for really ex-ante prediction and to what we call to do some optimal targeting. So we can really use machine learning to identify what are the key features or the optimal features of beneficiaries that can even maximize impact. So basically, we can detect what we call optimal selection rules. Here, for instance, here is an example of a project in Tanzania where we ran algorithms that were basically aimed at doing some optimal targeting here. And in essence, what we did is that the model selected here two variables, which is age and education. And we let the model vary this to identify the optimal targeting rules in terms of age and education so that we can maximize the welfare impact of this program in Tanzania. Here, of course, you benchmark basically against random assignment that gives you basically 20% impact. And here we found that we can get a 30% impact, so we double the impact, if we focus on an age threshold of 10. So basically, if we target all those age 10 and above, and we keep an education threshold of 8 years. So here we can maximize the positive impact of a program. Of course, we use ex-post evaluations to inform future programs, other things being equal, of course. And this is just basically the beauty of ex-ante targeting, pretty much, to understand how you can actually target the beneficiaries. These are just an example of two variables. So in a nutshell, I mean, this project aimed at giving IFAD an example of how really we can use machine learning for different purposes, really capitalizing on the data. So what the project achieved was really an integrated machine learning approach that can really enhance data-driven projects and even country program strategies. And that's why I say that machine learning can optimize development effectiveness. And development effectiveness here means actually having a structure that can embed evidence in each step of a project cycle. So here, what are the main win-wins of a project? And so we can inform the design on new operations. We can do some ex-ante targeting by proposing a menu of options for assigning project interventions in order to have impactful operations. Also, IFAD has an ICT4D development strategy that aims actually at incorporating or and having artificial intelligence and big data. But also, like, you know, the technologies, particularly on reports, have a huge potential for simplifying reporting, because basically we can really uncover themes and so minimize the time that people do this manually. So I can delve into recommendations for development agencies in the discussion. And this is all from my side. I want to acknowledge my team, of course, and the funders, which is who are the Change and Delivery and Innovation Management Unit at IFAD. And for any questions, I'm happy to respond. And thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Alessandra. Another interesting talk indeed. We're now moving into the panel discussion section of this where I'm going to selfishly exploit my chair's privilege to ask some questions of the panelists first. And starting with Michael on that fascinating talk about the uses of big data in evaluation. I wonder if you could say a bit more, Michael, about as big data being used more in natural experiments, whether this could represent a shift away from RCTs as the absolute gold standard, and more weight given to methods like propensity score matching, where that's sitting on top of much larger volumes of data. What do you think?
Okay, thank you. I think that natural experiments has the potential advantage that in most cases it's not possible to use randomized control trials. So with natural experiments, you're trying to use the data which is available and to match within the data using AI. So I just like to give very, very quickly one example. In the United States, there was a study which hasn't been published yet, but which was covering 250,000 districts around the US. And for each of these districts, all of the nonprofit organizations have to present very detailed tax information to the IRS. And this includes how many families were being reached in each of the districts, what kind of services they were operating. And this data covering 250,000 districts was combined with a deprivation index, which is developed by some of the health agencies to assess each of the areas in terms of the access to employment, to education, to health. And so they used the AI to identify districts which had similar characteristics, which were getting similar levels of, but which were having very different deprivation indexes. And so they then tried to see how this was related to the kind of services which were being matched, to try and see if you could identify an optimal level of services to affect education, health, and so on. And so then you can develop some predictions of how you might improve performance. And they haven't done that yet, but it is possible then to make recommendations on how to change the programs and to use real-time monitoring to assess whether programs are being improved. This is also done on smaller scale with individual programs, where, for example, social workers are visiting youth on a regular basis and recommending what should be done if youth have problems. And then you can come up again with natural experiments with similar situations where people are recommending different, whether you should be pull the child away from the home, whether you should have some intervention in the school. And you can see, again, do these natural experiments to see if you're getting different outcomes in similar situations. And in that case, you can recommend how to change the ongoing program. So this is why it becomes a very powerful management tool. You can actually improve programs while they're ongoing, rather than just doing a post-mortem when the program has ended several years later.
Thanks, Michael. That's fascinating. In the interest of time, I won't hog the microphone for any more interrogation of Michael. Instead, let's move on to a question for Maria. How frequent, Maria, are quality issues found in your experience to actually bias the results? Do you think it's a serious concern?
Yes, I definitely do. I think that, some of these issues like completeness and consistency that I was talking about in the presentation come up in every data set that we look at. The extent to which those would affect the results certainly vary by the kind of gravity of those issues, but there are always issues that do come up, and that's why I think we're really pushing people to kind of open that black box and explore a bit more what does the data look like, and doing so is something that is, recently more possible, right, than it was, because if you're getting an enormous data set, say you're getting data from a sensor that broadcasts every 30 seconds, every minute, right, and you have that data, it builds up and it can be huge over time. First of all, doing those checks in an automated way on a real-time basis helps, because every chunk that you receive is small. It's much more approachable than an enormous data set, but it's important to do, I think, on all data. And how much that affects the quality of the actual analysis, it's really going to depend, but it can have really significant impacts on the quality. So I don't want to understate that these are just some small outliers you might have to deal with here and there, but some of these outages, for example, if you lose data for a month from a particular cell phone tower, you might have and you're looking, for example, say at activity that you're trying to relate to disease transmission or tracking, right? All of a sudden, that's going to create a huge problem in your analysis. And if you don't know that it's there, you might lead you to some really spurious conclusions. If you know it's there, you may not be able to fix it, but at least you can identify that as being a data issue and not something real going on in that context.
Thanks. That makes really good sense. And I mean, all of the transparent and open analysis that you outlined, it's certainly principles that our team try to work by. So moving on to Alessandra, before we obviously open up to questions from the floor, I wonder if you could say a little bit, Alessandra, about whether that learning from the use of machine learning for improving the effectiveness of development programs at IFAD, whether that's getting fed back into the design of the admin data systems that the data is coming from.
Well, this is a great question, and I would say not yet, right? Because this is just the second phase of this innovation challenge. So we developed this, let's call it prototypes, and now they're yet to be scaled up, right? As I'm now in an operational division, I'm hoping actually to feed back into the data generating process. And particularly because I also wanted to stress that it's very, very hard to use an NLP or topic modeling on documents that are not structured. So, it's not just structured data, but also unstructured data like reports. For optimal use of machine learning, you need things to be structured in the same way, at least, like if you really want to find lessons learned in certain specific section. But yeah, ideally, like, you know, this is like, it was a challenge, the documentation, for instance, the heterogeneity of the documentation and setting everything. So giving some feedback in the way that the admin data actually is generated, that's the next step. So thanks for this question.
Thanks, Alessandra. Building on your discussion before of machine learning, as well as I think spreading in some of the epistemological and quality questions from the other panelists, I'll bring in a question now from the audience, where Rick has been asking about the need for ground truthing to identify, or I guess whether causal or not, to understand the effectiveness of machine learning in practice. What do each of you think? Does Alessandra first?
Yes, so I think that's actually a good point, because of course, I mean, particularly in the predictive analytics, I mean, you need to, I mean, IFAD has a very rich program of impact evaluations. And actually, we do impact evaluation on at least 15% on the entire portfolio of investment projects. So that's our, again, estimating like treatment effects with the standard causal, with the causal framework and running estimators in the econometric way, right? So you always have to combine, you need good counterfactuals. So you need internal validity, of course, and ideally external validity. So if you had a program of similar impact evaluations in different contexts, you would maximize external validity. So that's a given. And then machine learning, it's an add-on, right? And then you use this data to basically do this predictive analytics to actually digging more into the results and understanding the patterns that I showed. So we need good data sets with strong counterfactual, meaning we need treatment and control groups, ideally with strong identification strategies. And IFAD is actually striving to build stronger data systems, also as part of our monitoring evaluations. So I'm confident that we will be able to do more and more analysis in the future beyond the 15% of rigorous impact evaluations that are done by the research department. Over.
Thanks, Alessandra. And opening that same question about ground truthing and particularly for causal implications, as Michael might comment on to the rest of the panel. Does anyone else want to come
in? I can just chip in while other people are thinking. Ground truthing is absolutely critical. A very good example, there's hundreds of studies have been published on how you can use satellite images to identify the level of poverty in a community, very often by looking at the quality of the roof construction. And in many of these cases, there is no kind of ground truthing. The assumption is if the quality of the roof has improved, then the family is better off. And or if it hasn't improved, that their economic conditions haven't improved. And there are many reasons why this is not true, which you can only find on the ground. For example, just one example, many people migrate to rural areas for the season to earn as much money as they can to take back home. They don't want to spend anything on the house. So their economic conditions may have improved very significantly during the 6 months, but there's no change in the quality of the roof. They're not going to be living there. They don't want to waste money on that. So unless you actually check on the ground, you could come up with very misleading understandings. You could say the program had failed. Just one other example, which is really critical there, is if the quality of a house has improved, you very often assume that the program has been successful because the family now has more money to buy materials. Very often what has happened is the poor family has been thrown out of the house. I've been in situations where they've been thrown out at gunpoint, and a wealthier family now occupies the house. So the fact that it's now a better conditioned house doesn't mean that your program has been a success for the poor people. It means it's been a failure because all of the poor people have left. You won't know that unless you do ground truthing. And the other implication, you have to bring in theory. You have to know what you're looking at, because so often big data, you say, what data have we got? What can we do with the data? Rather than starting off by saying, what does our theory say about the issues we need to look at, and what kind of data do we need to be able to address that? So you need ground truthing, but you also need much more of a theoretical focus than you often have with big data. Some big data does have a theoretical framework, but much doesn't. There's even discussion you don't need theory with big data.
Thanks, Michael. I think that's a really important point. It seems that both Maria and Doug are ready to come in. Shall we go to Doug first?
Sure, thanks so much, Tom. I think these are great questions. Yeah, the ground truthing part is really important, something that came up in the big data systematic map, as well as we're noting the limitations of what can be, say, observed from above, because 70% of those studies actually were using satellite data. It's easily accessible and desirable from an impact evaluation perspective, because of the fact that you have this consistent picture across intervention areas and comparison areas. But it goes beyond satellite data as well. I was just thinking about a current event, a fairly recent event of the head of Google's ethical artificial intelligence team, Timnit Gebru, was forced out of her position. There's controversy about it, but one of the issues that she was highlighting was that these large natural language processing models that were being used by Google, that are being used by Google, they can only learn patterns based on the information they have. And they have information that doesn't represent a lot of people. And so they've noted that, for instance, groups that are not represented on the internet, those languages, those norms of those countries, then end up getting excluded. And so it's related to ground truthing. It's also important to think about what are the, which groups are represented in the underlying data. And that could include the impact evaluations themselves that may be used for synthesis or may be used for contributing to machine learning. Because some cases, the impact evaluations themselves probably should have more exploration of the heterogeneity of impacts. An average impact across a group may not show that it actually did not work well for the group that needed it most. And sometimes those things, you won't know that it's missing unless you have some engagement with local stakeholders, collection of data on the ground, mixed methods and qualitative components to it. And I would just lastly say to reflect on, or maybe react to what Michael just said about the importance of theory as well. There's a computer scientist, well-known computer scientist, who's been working in artificial intelligence and causal inference for years now, Judea Pearl. And in one of his recent books, he frequently says, data are profoundly dumb about causal relationships. And so we need to bring in the causal models in order to make sure that what we're finding is adding meaning and not just a pattern. Because if we find a pattern of, okay, this works when we see these conditions, we might repeat those conditions and inadvertently end up perpetuating some norms of inequity. Over.
I think that's a very important point. And I'm a great fan of Judea Pearl's work myself. Our team are working on administrative tools that could allow causal propositions within the designer programs to be recorded in a systematic way, so that admin data can be shared across the community and fed into algorithms, which might sort of double back to Alessandra's question, as well as addressing the point made in the chat about causality. Maria, I hope you'll forgive my poor sharing, but we're at time as far as I see it, which means before coming to you, I'll first need to just thank the whole panel for joining, and for 3IE for their support of this webinar too, as well as, of course, the UK taxpayer. Beyond those points, thank the audience for joining, and I hope that they'll join future sessions. And if the organisers will forgive it, let's go to Maria now for 5 minutes running over, and anyone who can stick around, please do. Maria, please go ahead.
Sure, I can actually just be very quick. I agree with all.
That was very quick. Very quick, and I think we possibly got the key point, which is that she agrees with the other panelists so far. If we don't get it back, then I think we'll close things out there. So I'll just repeat the thanks to everyone involved, and I look forward to future sessions. Thank you, and have a great rest of the day. Bye now.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.